Hey, welcome to Everyday Jesus. My name is Derek. I'm so glad that you're here with me today. It's been a few weeks since I've put up a video. We were out of town and man, just things have been going on, but I'm excited to be back with you today. If you've been around, the Western world much, or anywhere where Christianity has had an influence, you probably have heard about the idea of sin. Right? There are lots of concepts of what this means, a lot of understandings, a lot of frustrations with the idea of sin. And it's kind of a big thing. But one of the early church fathers described it with a Latin phrase as "homo incurvatus in se." I don't speak Latin. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but that phrase means man turned in on himself. And he uses that to describe, at least in part, the nature of what sin is, or a wrong action, we could say. A lot of times, we think of sin as just doing bad things, and what does that mean? And it's just way too broad and big of a topic to really fully cover here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that concept of sin, the incurvatus in se, turned in on oneself. You see this a lot in what Jesus was talking about. One of his most famous parables is the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? I don't know, you may be familiar with the story, but he gives this parable about a man that was on the road, and somebody jumped him and beat him up and robbed him and left him basically for dead on the side of the road. And Jesus describes two men that come by and see him there, hurt, bleeding, maybe dying on the side of the road. And because they're religious men, and there are laws about touching dead bodies or getting blood on you, all these things, there are these purity laws that they had. They walked by him. They went on to continue with their religious duties, these two men, and neglected to help someone in need. And then, of course, Jesus describes a Samaritan who at that time was not considered righteous, not considered holy, they weren't considered part of the good, privileged, or chosen people, right? They were kind of outside of the Jewish worldview, or the Jewish kind of acceptance or culture, I guess. They were just considered inferior to the Jews. Well, the Samaritan comes by and he sees this man who's bleeding and maybe dying on the road, and he comes and he helps him. He picks him up, he treats his wounds, he actually takes him to an inn where he pays the innkeeper and says, "Hey, take care of all of his needs." He has something that he needs to get to as well, but he pays the innkeeper and says, "Take care of this guy for me. Here's some money. I'll pay for what's needed. Just take care of him, nurse him back to health, and I will pick up the tab." And Jesus asks the question: which one of these men was really a neighbor or a friend to this man? This parable is told in part in response to the question. They're talking about the greatest commandments, and somebody says, rightly, Jesus says that one of the second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And someone says, well, who is my neighbor? Basically asking, how can I get out of that? Or where do I draw the line? And this parable is Jesus' response to that. And he says, who was the neighbor to this man, the man that was beaten? And of course they have to say, well, the Samaritan, like he loved him. As you just said, that we're supposed to love people. It was that Samaritan, kind of the outcast, the guy we don't like in this story is the guy that actually helped him. And I think so often we're focusing on the Samaritan in this story, and rightly so. He's this is in large ways Jesus' model of how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to love one another. He didn't know the guy on the side of the road, but Jesus is saying, he says so often in other places, lay down your life for your friends or for your neighbor, for someone who is near you that needs help. Anyone near you that you can help is your neighbor, is what he's saying in one sense. But it's interesting to me the flip side. What is he criticizing the Pharisee? I think there's a Pharisee in the story and maybe a Sadducee. I don't remember who it was, but religious men. He's criticizing those men for worrying so much about their own holiness, their own following of the rules, that they're neglecting, that they actually rejected helping someone else. I think this is an example of what later, I think it's St. Augustine that first coined the term, that people picked up on it, this homo incurvatus se, man turned in on himself. I mean, he's talking about pride in that sense in many ways, but also I think we can do the same thing if we're following Jesus, or if we're religious, if we're considering whether it's Christianity, whatever religion you might have, or whatever concept of even Christianity you might have. It's possible, and I think it's very dangerous to mostly conceive of that, of following Jesus or believing in God for my own benefit. Those men, those Pharisees, the other two men in the story, they were only worried about themselves, their own holiness. Now, in some sense, they were following the law. They were doing what God told them to do. But over and over, you see Jesus criticizing the Pharisees and the religious people for this. He's saying, you're doing the things that are written in the law, but you're missing the whole point of loving your neighbor. There's another point where they're so caught up in the law and in keeping their own personal holiness that they're upset with Jesus for healing a man on the Sabbath, their day of rest. They're commanded to rest, right? But they had turned it into a thing of, it's my personal holiness. I'm only focusing on me, and maybe criticizing other people for following the rules or not following them. But you see that individualistic, that self-focused, that inward curving concept, or that inward curving practice of believing in God, doing what He said, but really only for me. Sometimes it can be so easy to believe in God, do the things that He says, read Scripture, and think, what do I need to do? There's a big concept here, especially in the Western church. What do I need to do to get to heaven? What do I have to do? What do I not have to do? I talked about this in a previous video. If I'm just thinking, what do I have to do so that I can go to heaven when I die? Just tell me that, and and I'll forget other people. I'm just worried about myself here. This is the very thing that I think Jesus is speaking against. He's not calling us merely to think about our own selves. There is obviously a way of personal decision that has to happen. There is obviously a way in which we do have to care for our own relationship with God. But the reality is here that you see in all of Jesus' ministry and all throughout I think Scripture, that we can't truly love God if we don't truly love our neighbor, and vice versa. Loving God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength is irrevocably tied, inextricably linked to loving my neighbor as myself. It cannot just be an inward consideration of my own holiness, my own goodness, my own following of the rules, my own forgiveness, all these things. It cannot be just that. It's possible to think too much about our own holiness, our own relationship with God, that we forget that it's intimately connected with our relationship to others. And you see this, and there are lots of kind of outcroppings of this mindset, right? So often it's easy to constantly worry, like, am I doing enough? Am I doing the right things? Am I saved? Am I, what's going on with me? And my response might be, maybe you're worried too much about yourself. Maybe maybe there are times when we need to let go of ourselves and follow and obey Jesus' commandment and invitation to love one another in life-giving, transformative, powerful ways. If I'm following Jesus in loving and serving and blessing others in small ways and in big, I'm probably not as worried about my own holiness or my own salvation. I'm living out, as the Bible says, living out my salvation, living out my acceptance into His kingdom, my forgiveness in the lives of others, and in my acts of mimicking and modeling and serving as Jesus does. We are not called to just think about how we can get in, think about how we've gotten into heaven, and then we can stay there and not fall out or not whatever. It's possible to think too much about our own standing with God and not realize that the way we have a standing and a good relationship and a right relationship with God is to have a loving, blessing, serving relationship with others, those around us. The thing is, following Jesus is not a personal thing. It is a personal thing, but it's not only a personal thing. It is a relational thing. It is an outward-reaching, outward-facing kind of reality. You cannot truly follow Jesus and just be focused on yourself, your own goodness. Most of the ways, actually, that Jesus commands us to follow Him, most of the ways that He models and tells us to obey Him and serve Him, deal with not our own betterment, not our own becoming more holy, becoming more like Him just in and of itself, but deal with how we love and serve and interact with others. Let that sink in for a minute. The most frequent way that Jesus tells us to be like Him is in how we interact with others. So I encourage you today. I don't know where you're at. You may believe in Jesus. You may be following Him. You may be struggling with questions of your salvation. Am I really in? Am I really doing this? Does the Lord really see me? Does He accept me? I'm not saying that those are invalid questions. But I would say that if you're seeing the words of Jesus and the character of Jesus and saying, Lord, help me follow this. Lord, help me do this. Help me obey You in sincerity and in life. I think that's your answer right there. So I just encourage you to not think of your relationship with God as just your private thing. Following Jesus is anything but a merely private thing. There obviously is a private component to it, right? He doesn't call us just to go do a bunch of things for people and be goody-goodies and just do a bunch of charity work, but not actually relate to Him and serve Him. That's necessary as well. But again, those things are interlinked. You cannot do one without the other. You cannot love God and hate your brother. So I just encourage you to think about that this week or today as you have time. Look for ways, maybe there are ways that I'm mostly conceiving. If you're a Christian, if you consider yourself a Christian, maybe there are ways that you're mostly thinking of that as your way of personal improvement. There's a huge self-help, self-improvement kind of thing in our culture. And it's not entirely bad, but that's not what Jesus has called us to. He has not called us merely to our personal growth, and that hopefully maybe if it arises, maybe we can serve or bless somebody else. He hasn't called us to work out in a gym and get strong and buff, and maybe once in a while we can bless others by opening a can or lifting a car off somebody, or That's not what he's called us to. He's not called us to a life of self-improvement that might have a use somewhere. He's called us to a life of service and love that will inevitably strengthen us as we become more like him through action. I hope that makes sense to you today, and I hope that's encouraging you today. If you don't follow Jesus today, maybe you've seen people that you feel like, well, maybe they only care about themselves, or maybe you've considered religion as just a selfish thing. I've heard people say this, well, you're just concerned about yourself. But I want to be loving others. I've seen that conflict. But know today that is not the kind of life that Jesus invites you into. If there's a stirring in you for good things, for serving, making the world better, that's what Jesus has invited you into. But it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense without him. And that's a huge, long, big discussion that we can't fully have today. But if you have that urging in you, know that that's from the Father. That is from the God that made you. And that calls you in to serving his kingdom that is transforming the world and transforming hearts now and today. To me, that's an exciting thing, to realize that Jesus, the King of everything, has called me, who is nothing, to be a part of his transforming work of creation. Again, I don't want to get into bigger things than we have time for, but just know that that's what Jesus calls us into. He has not called us to be men and women turned in on ourselves, worrying about our own status with him or our own standing with him primarily. Of course, that's part of it. But the grander vision that he's inviting us into is an outward-focused, blessing, serving, changing his world with him in the lives of those around us. That's what Jesus calls us to. That is a life-giving thing. That will strengthen you and grow you. And in serving in an outward action, you will look more like Jesus. The less you focus on yourself, and the more you focus on how you can lay your life down to serve and bless others. That's the life he's called us to. The lie of our culture is that the more we fight for our own things, the more we fight for ourselves, the happier we'll be. That's a lie, and I think deep down we know it. We've seen it time and time again. So ignore that lie. Explore and accept and think about for a minute the idea that possibly true life is found in laying it down. True life is found in following and relating to Jesus through blessing and serving those around you. I hope that's encouraging to you today. And again, this is a huge topic and we'll talk more about it. But this is what I want for you. This is what I want for me. A life not just lived for myself, but lived for those around me as Jesus calls me to. And in so doing, Jesus says, "He who would save his life will lose it, but he who lays it down for my sake will find it." I believe that. And I encourage you to think about that today. Bless you, and I'll see you next time.